Meet Sanaya, a young, queer person of color who runs a social enterprise that hires refugees and newcomers to teach ethnic cooking classes in Toronto. They're looking to expand, but access to financing has been difficult. Every mainstream financial institution wants them to put their life on the line for any loan. And most banks don't even understand what a social enterprise is. So they recently turned to the social finance world. But that hasn't landed them anywhere either. One loan almost came through, but they weeded them out as not being investment ready. And we know that Sanaya isn't the only one. So what do we need to unlearn and reimagine when it comes to equitable access to finance?
Welcome to the plenary session on reimagined access at the 2023 Social Finance Forum. My name is Vinod Rajasekaran. I'm publisher and CEO at Future of Good. I am a first-generation settler speaking to you today from unceded, unsurrendered, and occupied Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in what is colonially known as Ottawa. As someone who immigrated to Canada when I was about 9 years old, it's important for me to recognize and acknowledge the privileges I have as a settler through Canada's colonial systems, including what we're about to talk about today, access to capital. This is a plenary session that is anchored in the lived experiences of entrepreneurs, intermediaries, social purpose organizations, and funders. And let me state the obvious. The flow of capital is not uniform, it's not right-sized, and it's not equitable. It varies depending on mission, maturity of organization, legal structures, so-called investment readiness, demographics, but also transparency of the process itself and who's at the table deciding. And whether you have to, piece together crumbs of money from, 25 funders, or whether you have to sign away your arm, leg, kidney, home, and more to access capital. But at the crux, though, of a lot of this is invisible and visible systemic injustices, as well as institutional and structural racism that bottleneck capital flows. So for this plenary, joining me are 6 extraordinary leaders from across the ecosystem. They'll dive into questions like, how has access to funding and capital shifted in the past 5 years? Who has better access to funding and financing and who doesn't? What are the biases at play? Has due diligence changed at all? How can we redefine risk? What are the factors that contribute to more equitable access? And you'll learn from these leaders, entrepreneurs, and change makers with insights from the ground and from their communities who are making promising strides in equitable access to funding and financing. These folks will openly reflect, share, debate, and challenge the experiences, the tensions, and the frustrations they and their communities navigate every day when it comes to accessing financing and opening up access to capital. And they'll dig deeper into why we're not moving faster on access. So let's get started. First off, let's do a lightning round of introductions. I'll first give each of you the opportunity to very quickly introduce yourselves and share the traditional ancestral territories you're joining us from. So remember, folks, this is a lightning round, so name, role, and organization only, please. Justin, let's start with you.
My name is Justin Sweeney. I am the Social Finance Manager with Kaleidoscope Social Impact. I'm joining you from the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Wolastoqiyik and the Mi'kmaq First Nations, and we are governed under the Peace and Friendship Treaties and have been since the late 1700s. And we're in St. John, New Brunswick is our colloquial name.
Welcome, Justin. Hillary.
Anim Bojo, Hillary Indigenicas. I am Hillary Tanud. I'm with Canadian Roots Exchange, a national Indigenous youth organization, and I am located here today on Algonquin unceded territory in Ottawa.
Welcome, Hillary. Narinder.
Hi, I'm Narinder. I'm here with two hats, New Power Labs and the Sonar Foundation. And I'm here on Treaty 13, which is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga Pacific Credit, the Nishobe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people.
Thank you, Narinder. Welcome. Jonah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jonah Chininga, CEO and co-founder of Wovio, a social enterprise reimagining access to credit. And I'm calling in from Calgary, Alberta on the West Coast.
Welcome, Jonah. Victor?
Yes, give thanks, Vinod. My name is Victor Beausoleil. I am a husband, father of four, currently the executive director or steward of SETSI, which stands for Social Economy through Social Inclusion. And I'm joining you from Accra, Ghana, West Africa.
Welcome, Victor. And Nabila.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nabila. I'm a principal at the TELUS Pollinator Fund. I'm located on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, and Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas, more commonly known as Hamilton.
Super. Welcome, Nabila. Let's dive right in. I want to begin with the experience of accessing funding and accessing capital. So let's paint a picture of what access to capital is like as an entrepreneur, as a founder raising capital. Jonah, you're an entrepreneur, you're a founder. Give us your take. Bring us into your experience. What's it been like?
Yeah, no, thanks, Vinod. So raising capital for us has been really challenging, just because of the position that we hold within the marketplace. So for us, we're a social enterprise, and one thing that you do realize is you're in between two worlds, right? So one, you have traditional systems where they measure risk and returns, and then on the other side, as a social enterprise, you're trying to connect with impact investors, where we're trying to measure risk, returns, and impact. And our experience really has been frustrating because I think within the impact world, I think it's been a lot of talking, not a lot of action. And then within the traditional ecosystems is really kind of those complex systems that we have that makes it harder to be able to access affordable capital, or whether it's investment to be able to build an enterprise. For myself, I'm an immigrant to Canada. I came here in 2014, and really raising capital as an immigrant is really challenging. One, you have to deal with the documentation process. You have to also deal with settlement, building in networks within the communities that you haven't been part of. And that makes it extremely difficult to be able to build those networks, to be able to access capital, to build the enterprises. But then we're doing this from a point of passion. And for some of us, we're solving problems that are lived experiences for some of the things that we've gone through. So how can we reimagine these processes to be able to do that and then also bridge that gap? I think one thing for me that's missing, especially focusing within the impact investment world, I think we're missing a point within the life cycle of an enterprise, which is experimentation to be able to build new solutions that are impactful. I think we are more risk averse within the ecosystem, not willing to take bets to be able to prove this model that we're calling impact investment, social finance. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, especially from an early stage standpoint, to be able to improve access to capital.
And so, Jonah, you're saying that there's insufficient capital for experimentation and early stage ventures.
Exactly. Yeah. No, the barriers are really, especially right now, given kind of the macroeconomic conditions, it's really tough, because for some of us, especially for us at Wovio, we are working on big ideas to be able to solve bigger problems. But then when you're solving those bigger problems and you're under-resourced, it makes it for a more frustrating experience. So how can we be able to bridge that gap between the impact world and those entrepreneurs on the ground? How can we connect with those people on the ground who are building the solutions to be able to bridge those gaps? And I think there's a lot of bottlenecks from the top in terms of we have investment readiness program. How are they getting access to those entrepreneurs to be able to do that? We have different programs, but then really for us, we haven't been able to tap into those networks because of just kind of I don't know if I want to call it hierarchy or just in terms of governance processes. But then also that process is very time consuming from an entrepreneurship standpoint, where we are trying to build these solutions, and speed and competition in the market is really, really important to us.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the investment readiness program, because that is sort of the, in many ways, a singular thing a lot of folks are sort of pointing to saying, well, there is that investment readiness program that is purpose-built, or supposedly purpose-built, for the very thing that you're saying. But Have you been able to access the funding from Investment Readiness Program?
Not at all. For us, it is.
Why is that, do you think?
Yeah. So for us right now, in terms of our funding journey, we've been able to raise a pre-seed round. And due to our frustrations and experiences, really, we ended up having to go to traditional sources of capital, which was very hard, very competitive, because as a social enterprise, we are mission focused. We're a mission focused team trying to solve problems that are really aligned to our passion, lived experiences, that we're trying to bridge that gap. And when you go to the traditional means, you're trying to compete in a world of whether it's venture capital, you're trying to compete in that world because that's the option that you're left with. And then if you are really not enabled to be able to access these forms of capital within the social finance space, then your only means is kind of how do you go back to the traditional, how do you try to fit in within the framework? And then that's destroying the purpose of that organization and then how it is started.
Right. I want to get into what you mentioned, measuring risk and return. So I want to get into risk and return a bit later, but I want to sort of, if you could offer one piece of feedback to, given your experience, right? If you could offer one piece of feedback to the folks who ran the Investment Readiness Program, what would that be?
Yeah, my biggest advice is really around experimentation, early stage, taking on big bets. I think as an investment readiness program, really your job is to be able to take that early stage risk adjustment return from a perspective of like, how can we be able to allow entrepreneurs to experiment? That's the first point. Before you are able to quantify impact, you need to be able to experiment, and investment readiness is about providing that capital. So if we're able to change our mindset from being risk averse to be able to like, how can we enable within an environment that's conducive to allow experimentation that's going to bring solutions to the market to be able to bridge that gap. The social finance space is a new space, especially for me, and we need to be able to prove our models, our solutions with winners, with impact, and then how can we be able to do that from a grassroots level where we're looking at solutions that can be able to bridge those gaps, whether it's from affordable housing, access to affordable credit, different solutions that are solving bigger problems that we have in society right now. How can we look at early stage experimentation that can enable for us to be able to get and quantify impactful solutions over time?
Right. When you're approaching a lot of these, you mentioned, sort of traditional mainstream, institutions, like, do they, let's just actually kind of dabble into the risk question here. Do they understand risk differently as you're explaining your purpose and the impact that you're looking to generate?
Yeah, from my experience, I think it's more about taking a safe bet. So sometimes if it's from a government perspective, you don't want to take that risk, right? You're trying to protect from the other side of a risk not bridging the return that you're expecting. But I think for the problems that we're trying to solve, we have to look at new solutions. Existing solutions haven't worked for a long time. And then how can we look, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we're going to keep getting the same results. We're having new demographics in Canada. We're having new experiences. We're living in a high cost environment. So it's a time whereby we need to be able to nurture new solutions within the marketplace. So how can we enable them to be able to support those entrepreneurs? For me, I'm connected with the entrepreneurs within the social enterprise space. And that's the feedback that I've been getting, really under-resourced, but then really a lot of talented and purposeful people who are trying to solve the solutions, but then there's no connection to the funding streams that currently exist within the ecosystem.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's get into this a bit later, because yesterday we heard a fair bit from the social finance fund wholesalers about the types of streams that could become available. And one of the things that kept coming up from a few folks is this is by and large a repayable fund, and so Are they only going to take safe bets? Like that's what you mentioned, and then that's the sort of the challenge. And so, but the safe bets often are insufficient. So we'll get into this a bit more. I want to sort of
so just to say something like, what is safe? What is safe, right? Usually, safe is a proxy to somebody who looks like me, who talks like me, who's been educated in the same way, right? So you have to really deconstruct what safe is through the investment process and understand the bias that exists. There's some really interesting research on gender and like women going through the VC process. Women are viewed, even if it's the exact same pitch, they are still viewed to be less ambitious, to be, not kind of aiming for the $1 billion business. They get asked more liability type questions. So there's a lot of things about deconstructing what risk is in this process of reevaluating how capital flows.
But is that happening though, Narinder? Are folks deconstructing what is safe?
I think there's intentionality to re-envision, how we look at different types of deals.
Right, but intention isn't action though.
Well, that's the thing. That's going to be known if we have numbers and data around who we're funding, which we don't have. And so it's going to be hard for us to even assess progress if we don't have a baseline to today understand how capital is flowing and impact investing.
Yeah, but who's collecting the data?
Victor, yeah, jump in.
Is it New Power Labs collecting data?
We're trying.
No. I know you're trying, but I'm saying, how easy is it for you to go in and close a deal with the 3 wholesalers versus, let's say, another organization? And I think that's the key piece. When I hear Jonah speak about hierarchy, I think we have to call a spade a spade. We're dealing with a sector that is governed by greed and capitalism, imperial mindsets, colonial constructs, period. And the fact remains that over the past 5 years, I've seen patriarchy and misogyny in meetings that you wouldn't believe. I've seen anti-racism, anti-Black racism that you wouldn't believe. When Jonah talks about the investment readiness program, that was a remarkable program that still exists to this day. But it was about ecosystem building and ecosystem mobilization. So the fact that we have to do ecosystem building, ecosystem mobilization, ecosystem awareness raising was a great thing. But we've moved from ecological terms like ecosystem to wholesalers. My ancestors were wholesale sold. So we're using terms that are more sexualized. We're using an approach that does not fit. And more importantly, we are not doing the market making that we should be doing. The fact that Jonah's talking about the IRP from the angle that he is important because I think it was a successful program. But the fact remains we have to do market fixing on the tail end. The foundations for Black communities ended up being investment readiness partner after years of advocacy. And that advocacy takes a toll on Black bodies, Black lives, Black families, Black communities. So we had to, it took years to get an investment readiness partner that was Black-led, the Foundation for Black Communities, and they just had their first round of funding, and they only have one singular round that happened over the past, let's say 7 to 8 months, very recent. And they didn't even have a direct contribution agreement with the federal government. So it was market fixing that happened. And the same thing's gonna happen with this $400 million fund that should be $755 million with communities that are underfunded. So when we talk about polls around folks being underfunded and trying to figure out what we call social finance, we're forgetting that the only way these wholesalers have capital is predicated and validated on these underfunded communities. This is blood money. Let me say it again, this is blood money. People had to suffer, struggle, vulnerable, distinct populations across Canada had to go through great plights. And now we have the same mainstream leaders or leadership taking hold of a fund that should reach SPOs. We don't even know how it's going to reach intermediaries yet. So I'll stop there because it's not a TED Talk, but I really think that we have an opportunity not to reimagine, deconstruct. We have to speak truth to power and say, this is wrong, this is right. An all white-led panel to announce a social finance fund, wrong. And that was flagged before it happened, wrong. And we need more people to say that's wrong. Disaggregated data in Quebec. How many SPOs were funded by the IRP? How many intermediaries are going to be engaged from the Black community in Quebec? Because FFBC was not allowed to fund Black-led SPOs in Quebec because it's already partners. Wrong. So until we have adjacent allies, until we have folks that are literally abolitionists and really willing to deal with anti-racism within this ecosystem, and once again, ecosystem, not sector, we're going to be in trouble.
So much to jump in there, Victor, but just as a quick follow-up, you mentioned market fixing. Tell us, like, just expand on that a little bit, and who has the onus to do the market fixing work?
I think the letter that's going to the Prime Minister's office from over 145 organizations, the letter going to Karina Gould, the letter going to Kieran Hall, the joint statements from the Solidarity Working Group going in to multiple parties to say, listen, you, in the investment readiness program, you did not deploy a Black-led investment readiness partner, and you saw the results. Right now, you have the Social Finance Fund. There was a $50 million carve-out from inception through the Indigenous Growth Fund for Indigenous communities. You have some very specific vulnerable distinct groups that you're prioritizing or saying you want to prioritize, and we want a Black-led wholesale. And that's a perspective of market fixing that we had to do in IRP, the first iteration of IRP for IRP 2.0, which made sense because the first iteration was successful, but it could have been more successful. It included more voices.
Sure. I want to get into carve-outs in a bit later, but Hilary, I want to turn to you. Share with us your experience of trying to secure funding for Canadian Roots Exchange. The organization, this is a grassroots organization you lead. The organization's been around for many years, but like you and I have had conversations about how many hoops you had to jump through. So give us a little bit of your insight and experience around that.
Yeah, miigwech for that. I will say we're a national organization with the heart of grassroots. It can be very difficult for us with our national scope to actually be considered as a grassroots organization, but so much of our work is supporting the grassroots movement through more specifically Call to Action 66. It's been incredibly difficult to acquire funding for this work, and we're often competing in these opposing worlds. Our team comes to this with the spirit of looking at this from a 7 generations perspective. And so the best way I can kind of illustrate that dichotomy would be around, I use the word miigwech when I say thank you. But my teachings have always been that no one goes without and you only take as much as you need. And when the word miigwech, which now translates to thank you, what my language teacher, Louise Garreau, told me is we actually never had a word for thank you. It was because it was so understood that as a community, we would just take care of each other no matter what. So there was never this need for an exchange of something. And so when we look at acquiring capital, when we look at acquiring funding, it's already this very differing fundamental belief of how to sustain and take care of your community. And more often than not, organizations like myself, our organization and so many others, we're constantly pinned against each other to be fighting for the same pot of funding. And so many of us are coming to the table in our funding applications looking at, if we take this funding, are we taking this away from someone else who's doing the exact same work? And there has to be these really big conversations that happen at the table of what is the impact of us having to navigate this machinery that is ultimately just trying to divide us at the end of the day. I think what can be incredibly difficult, and I'll speak to last year, was so many of our contributions are in the spirit of reconciliation, in advancing that. And right now, we see a country that is still quite significantly falling behind on it, but there's this giant narrative to steward this work forward. And still more often than not, it's falling on the shoulders of Indigenous organizations and people to have to continue funneling that work back into the front lines, into grassroots. And the resources above to acquire capital are very limited in which to do so. So we're often facing this approach of how do we take these decolonized beliefs around the sustainability. And I have this conversation often with so many other Indigenous youth, Indigenous organizations that right now in this time in 2023, we're striking while the iron is hot. I don't know what's going to happen in 2025. I don't know what that means for our organization. And that is terrifying. But it is also not unlikely for Indigenous organizations to just disappear overnight due to a shift in government. I've seen that in my lifetime. And so our job in this last year has been to acquire more diverse capital. And how do we expand on that? And it's, again, there's always these competing interests at play. And we've been around for a while, but we're still a very young organization at heart. And so it is about, when I go to these tables, it's constantly me asking, like, who do I need to talk to get me capital? Where do I need to go? Put me in the right spaces. And that's been a main mission, which again is so internally conflicting for me, because I just want to be able for us to support Indigenous youth who are the future of this country. And a lot of times that will have to come with sacrifices, unfortunately.
Thanks, Hilary. I want to pick up on this this feeling that you're carrying around this. This is internally conflicting. right? And you mentioned this a little bit, and in many ways, I've been, this has been something this isn't new. The way a lot of these processes are run, they're run as competitions, and that's just been it. And even when governments consult on how to run a process, and there is ample feedback to not run it that way, it still ends up being run like a competition. So my question, I suppose, is and you mentioned the machinery is trying to divide us. So how are you navigating that internal sort of feeling that you're carrying in relation to other organizations that are there from coast to coast to coast, and in your mind can competition be good?
We place integrity of our community above everything else. And we have had to walk away from funders knowing that it would be in direct competition with other either grassroots organizations. And my board I'm very lucky. I have a really great board right now. They're very supportive of this because our integrity to who we are and how we build this out later will come back tenfold. And again, it always comes back to my teachings, but one my mother always raised us with: if you stay in the light, Creator sorts the rest. And that can be really difficult in the meantime. And as mentioned, Vinod, we talked about this last summer. We were almost ready to close our doors. And I never want to go back to that, because the work that we're doing to mobilize, reconciliation on the grassroots level is just incredible. And there's so many other groups out there. In the eyes of this word, say like competition, I do see it in value of being able to change the system a bit to maybe competition, maybe not competition capital C, but competition in the sense of let's change that into innovation. What are different ways that we can still navigate and operate in the machinery that is making us compete against each other, but how can we bring pieces together? And I'll bring one example up. We are now in a process where we're trying to secure long-term funding in the next few years. And we have decided that instead of going with the regular template, we are going to be dismantling the template. And I'm trying to bring other Indigenous youth organizations to the table to cement this and to say the way we distribute funding does not work and it should be equitably done. And it's incredibly, it's scary. It's really scary because I don't know if they're going to respond to that. But I just know in our heart of hearts, and this is also the sad reality and the plight for Indigenous people, is the work that we're doing at CRE and the work that so many other organizations are doing, this is a bundle. And this is a bundle that we've been carrying since time immemorial and since colonialism. We have been carrying this work after generation, and it looks different every time, but we are still here as Indigenous people and we are still pushing the pen. And every time we get closer and closer and closer, that doesn't make it right, but we are resilient people and we will keep going. Even if that means we have to close our doors, which we don't want to do.
Right. Thank you, Hillary. A couple of things I want to pick up on a bit later with you, but I want to get a few other takes on competition. Victor, you look like you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, no, well, one, thank you, Hillary. To stay in the lights, the Creator sorts the rest. My mother gave me something very similar. Walk in the light of the sun as if all can see you at all times, because all does. Beautiful storytelling, and I appreciate your strength, resilience, and vulnerability. To your points, Vinod, in terms of the work around competition, I know myself, my elder Emmanuel Meles, and quite a few others have been working on healing and reconciliation within the Black community after Blacklight Endowment Fund catastrophe. That model and framework pitted large Black intermediaries against each other, and they had to engage nonprofits and SPOs and social enterprises and businesses within the Black community around endorsement letters. That caused a chasm. That caused a huge divide within the Black community. That caused arguments and contention, and was very problematic from inception. So in terms of the competitive processes that our federal government or private philanthropic, whatever sector is on the supply side of capital, develops to kind of let the market decide has to recognize that through a competitive process, it needs to be coupled with the healing and reconciliation process. If you're going to have folks compete against each other for a pot of resources and decline some and others, or maybe have processes that you feel are transparent, but everyone else believes is opaque, or as you termed it, a black box, Vinod, recently in your editorial, I think there needs to be resources allocated specifically around the healing and reconciliation work after the fact, because it creates generational divides. There's elders within the Black community that have not spoken to each other since Paul Martin because of a meeting that happened with Paul Martin. Can you imagine that? Like, I couldn't make this stuff up if I wanted to. There are Black leaders in Canada that have not spoken in years over competitive processes. That changes the trajectory of entire communities, of organizations, of a nation. So I'm saying all this to say that with the stroke of a pen, a policy is enacted, resources are announced, a lot of times in a very undiverse, unequitable way, and you leave communities in shambles with the veneer of social outcomes. When I heard a quote yesterday from my colleagues, someone said, social finance has basically taken the power structures of regular finance and mirrored it. I'm not gonna say who said it, but I thought it was a beautiful quote because that's what I've experienced for the past 5 years since the fall economic statement of 2018 around the social finance fund. And hiring a few staff or sharing power and pictures with racialized diverse groups does not speak to the power dynamics within that fund.
Right. Thanks, Victor. Want to bring a few others in. Justin, I'll turn to you here. There's so many threads to pick up on, but one in particular that I want to, dig into with you is, as an intermediary, you folks are often caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to expanding access to capital, and there's lots to get into here. You folks are going to be part of a competition process, and you already have been parts of competition processes. The thing that is striking for me, though, is and you and I spoke a little bit about this, is there are alternative funding models, that are at the edges right now, and in some communities, they have been practicing these models for ages and ages, totally, fully legitimatized, but we're struggling with this, and I wonder if in your work as an intermediary, how are you going to navigate this? Because as an example, you and I spoke about things like character-based lending, like that. This isn't new. Character-based lending it's been happening for thousands of years. But how do you square character-based lending with something like the social finance fund that is supposed to be mostly repayable? How do you pull those two together? Justin, I think you're on mute.
I had to be the one, right? I had to be the one. Thanks, Vinod. I appreciate amazing panel, amazing perspectives, and I'm just appreciative to be here and to be part of this. From an intermediary perspective, I would say as a community finance intermediary perspective who works purposely with underfinanced, underbanked populations, specifically those who are, low income, newcomer, we have to be pretty flexible and diverse. We're New Brunswick, we're small, we have 800,000 spread out over, over our province. We have to be a few things to a few different people in order to support the different social finance needs here. But we have affordable housing developers who can't get capital in order to be able to get shovels into the ground or acquire properties. These things are challenges, right? And so, our entire model is built off debt. It's debt in, it's debt out. And, our model was built off a social finance fund that could potentially arrive at the intermediaries at -1% to +1%. We need to have some level of capacity for a loan loss, or if we're going out and doing community-based financing, when we do character-based, it's very administratively heavy. There's little to no return based on the activity itself. But this activity saves lives. It literally saves lives. What Victor's saying is not untrue. Like I'm in a ward right now where our childhood poverty rate is 50%. Like our average life expectancy in this ward is like 10 years younger than the Canadian average. Like people are dying younger. The social determinants of health and access to finance and banking are being seen actively in these communities. We can see it. The challenge is, the problem, why we're not moving faster, is because the impetus for change lies with those who have no power. Lies with those who are grassroots, who are continuously coming forward, trying to create a voice, trying to create advocacy, getting a small win with the announcement of the Social Finance Fund, and then experiencing delays where it's arriving now in 2020, 5 years later. We're intermediaries. We have to cover operational costs over this period of time. We have foundations who are trying to back us to get to the point where the fund actually rolls out so we can get these dollars. And then now we're going to have to relook at our model, because we were thinking we were going to be able to go to, if we need to average, let's say 3%, on the return that we can offer investors. So we can go out, because what we do is we do a lot of affordable housing lending. We lend to affordable housing developers so they can do construction financing and acquisition. It's 80% of our business. It's very, very clean. It's very low risk. But what that does is it stabilizes our activity, and it gives us about 20% of our fund where we can do more high risk activities like social enterprise development as well as community financing. Now, our challenge is, if I'm going to be a benefit to affordable housing developer, I have to get that to them at 5 or 6%. Well, we need to average our cost of capital at 2.5 to 3%. Well, the Social Finance Fund was supposed to be the 0 to 1% piece that allowed us to go to the private sector and offer them 4 to 5% so we could get the matching. But now if I'm already at 3%, right, when it arrives with me, well, I've got nothing to offer. I can't go better for the private sector. And they're demanding and they're looking for better right now. So we're in a place right now as an intermediary where we're trying to provide services to these communities. We're hitting delays. Delays literally for us mean pipeline management right now, deferring applications, which is in effect deferring real estate projects, which defers housing starts during an affordable housing crisis.
Right.
So this is what we're waiting for. And this is, so with, the arrival, with what we're seeing, the way that it's rolling out from a community finance perspective, yeah, I'm disappointed. I think we're going to be challenged to really reconcile the two. We're left without things. As intermediaries, we need capacity building support. These are going to be mostly first-time fund managers, right? There's going to be a lot of first-time fund managers. There needs to be capacity building support there. There needs to be an expectation that there could potentially be some level of loan loss. Like we need to be able to take those risks to support and build up that ecosystem. But, going back to what Jonah said about trying to play it safe all the time, right? I mean, that's, it feels like, in 2018, that's just when I joined. I was like, oh, wow. Like I just got into social finance at that time. I'm like, this is taking off. This is super exciting. The practitioners are amazing. The practitioners are out of this world. The innovation that needs to come together in order to create the investment vehicle just to do this work is out of this world. There's no supportive legislation like the CDFI legislation you have in the US that's enabling those community development institutions. So, we're out there scrambling, pulling this together as best as we can. And this was supposed to be a big win, we thought, for the community finance sector. And I don't think it's going to be if it rolls out and we're paying those kinds of percentage points to support a wholesaler, and the continued growth at the wholesaler level. I don't know how we're going to create any growth at our level, at an intermediary who's doing community finance. We're put back into a situation where we're going to be able to maybe sustain operations, but we're not going to be able to grow an evergreen fund that continues to meet the social innovation needs in a small rural space like New Brunswick, right? So, at the end, I think we need more IRP capital. There needs to be more non-repayable capital for SPOs. I got to sit in on all three of the for the awarding committee for our area. I work with the Community Foundation. I got to see the progress of groups going through, but we failed to communicate, at least in my area, the ones I was looking at, that one, you could reapply and continue to move your entity across the investment readiness spectrum, and then or the continuum. And not only that, we really kind of, we didn't get a lot of the ecosystem development. I look forward to having more of a conversation with Victor and where he saw a lot of success in the IRP. I saw great success for some individual SPO level in where we administered, but definitely did not see the ecosystem development I might have hoped for. And so, yeah, that's my kind of TED talk on the experience so far. But it is, we subsidize really good, meaningful work that takes place in a community where most people don't want to touch it. Okay, and this is where we build, this is where we do our activity. But it's again, that does not reconcile with kind of a private equity venture model. And if that's what a lot of us are thinking about when we look at the social finance fund and how it's going to roll out, I don't know. Again, I'm just I think it's a great first step, but there's a lot of additional needs within the ecosystem if this is going to play out well over the next decade.
Right, and it goes back to some of the points that earlier that Jonah and others made around sort of like safe bets, redefining risk, etc. I'm from Truro, by the way, so I know in Nova Scotia, they have SEDDIVs, right? And yes. So there's some really interesting work happening through that entity. So Nabila, I want to bring you in here and perhaps. Not to put you on the spot, but I am putting you on the spot. The Pollinator Fund released, you folks released your second report. Lots of success stories in there. How are you taking in all of what you've heard so far? How are you folks? Are you redefining risk? Are your bets too safe? Like, give us an inside sort of scoop on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate the candid conversation today, and it's conversations that emerge internally in terms of the barriers that we see and how we have to work within our construct that exists and is real in order to address them. So the Pollinator Fund is a corporate social impact fund. We make equity investments. And I think a lot of those words speak for the framework that we operate in today. The lens that we're taking is, we're making venture investments with the benefit of an LP that cares about what we're calling social capitalism. It gives us a lot of flexibility to play around with the meaning of venture in this space. And it's a learning experience for us. I'm not going to say we're perfect at it. And it comes to a few points that I've been thinking about. One, access to capital, which we're talking about today. But it goes beyond the first check. The point right at the top about painting the picture of what barriers look like. It's not just barriers to get in right at the start, which look overwhelming, but frankly, there's barriers after you get the money too. When you're going back into the market to look for capital again, it seems like folks from underrepresented backgrounds are held to a different standard and are challenged differently when they're coming back for, the second or third re-up. And that's going to influence what growth and success looks like in that space. And so we're thinking really carefully about how do we need to imagine what success looks like for them? How do we bring their vision more into this space? And what does success look like for a fund of ours where we do want to be more patient capital? And if you're being with market returns, but when the market is based on time-based returns, how do you need to redefine that construct so that you can show that this is a win for communities, this is a win for the fund, and this is a win for the ecosystem so that we can inspire more people to bring their money into a space. And so, again, it's going to be iterative. We don't have the answers, but what we're hoping for, and what this session is great for, is feedback from the market so we can continue to learn and grow.
Right. And there's a lot of success stories in that report, but what is one learning in the past couple of years, would you say?
The report focuses a lot on impact measurement and management, and it's something that we're building as a foundation for the future of the fund and what we're sharing really broadly as well, especially with the impact navigation tool that we put out, which is a guide for founders to be able to figure out where they are in their impact journey and figure out the steps that they need in order to move forward. I feel like that's where we focused so much of our time and energy, and realizing like there's good intention, and then it's easy in the traditional finance sector to have all of these measurements and benchmark it against each other because you're talking about money, you're talking about numbers. It's very straightforward. If you then take that monetary framework and add the impact lens to it, where there's so much nuance, and it's really difficult to benchmark KPIs against each other because it's apples and oranges in many cases, the whole conversation becomes really complex. And so the challenge that we've seen is how can we attempt to, I don't want to say like bring more of a framework to that conversation, but help folks speak to the impact that they're creating in a way that resonates with more traditional finance, so that we can, again, encourage more capital into that sector. And it's a bit of coming up and coming down from a language perspective. So many people who are building in these spaces are speaking from their lived experiences and their passions, and sometimes that doesn't translate in the finance world. And I think we have this expectation of you need to speak like us so that we can evaluate what you're doing and determine if you should get capital or not. And we need to shift that a little bit. And that's the challenge that we have in the work that we're trying to do with the impact framework.
And who are you folks including in creating this impact framework? Like who gets to be included in designing the framework?
The framework was designed, and it's an evolution. I'm not going to say again, this is it out in the market, with other leaders in the community, folks that have been working in it for a long time. But I will say it takes our perspective in terms of what it means to measure impact. And so we were really fortunate to be part of a cohort to learn about the best practices in impact measurement and management. It's not something that we came up with ourselves. What we're doing is looking at best in class in the environment today and consolidating it into a guideline. So again, not saying that, we've made this up and now this is the best and you have to follow it, but kind of sifting through what exists right now, because it is a complicated landscape, and trying to simplify it down so founders don't have to spend that mental energy doing the work to figure out what they need to do and can make the time and space to do it if they wish.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, it goes back to some of the points that Jonah was saying at the very outset. Like who gets to, who gets to characterize what is and what isn't a safe bet, and so that's the sort of the spirit in which I ask. I want to switch gears a little bit, and the past couple of years, and it even came up yesterday, there was a lot of chitter chatter about trust-based funding. And I'm sure all of you folks have heard this. And maybe Narinder, I'll start with you. Did it ever have any promise? Like where are we with this? And it in many ways it felt like there was a window a couple of years ago where this could really become something meaningful. But then it now feels like that window is closing.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, trust-based funding. And I think you see it more prevalent in philanthropy, where trust-based granting, decentralizing control, having participatory giving, like that is kind of where you're seeing some of these models be more vibrant and have increased uptake. Part of this, there is some financial objectives. There are other considerations that come when you do have repayable capital. And so that is an important consideration when you think of how you apply different types of models within a space where you are trying to create a different type of funding mechanism. Now, that said, if I just step back for 2 seconds, and maybe I'll give some context on my vantage point. So I'm an engineer, worked in traditional finance for a bit, and then for the last 15 years have been doing a few things, but I have raised philanthropic capital, I've raised impact capital, I've deployed philanthropic capital, I've deployed impact capital. So I've kind of sat in this middle, and I continue to sit in this space where I'm doing both things on a daily basis, which gives an interesting vantage point of how we think about trust, how we think about bias, who we let in to engage in building out the systems and defining the processes, defining those approaches. I think it goes back to then, like, what do we know about how capital flows in Canada when it comes to impact investing? And so if I take the vantage point of New Power Labs now, which is, we're a think tank that looks at how capital flows across the capital spectrum to underfunded communities, whether it's philanthropic capital, impact capital, venture capital, and so on, and across all diversity types, right? We're talking about race, gender, ethnicity, indigenous identity, abilities, citizenship status, class, which is, again, something we don't tend to talk about, but is so core to who gets access to capital and who doesn't. We're very focused on thinking about how data has a power for us to do better in this. So whether it is trust-based lending or it is traditional approaches of lending, what does the data say? Are we actually shifting capital to communities that are underfunded? What we know is that we have few data points in venture. I'll just share two. Less than 4% of venture goes to women founders. 90% of venture capital goes to founding teams that are exclusively male. My question always becomes, have we done something different in impact investing in the space of social finance? From the limited data that we have, it doesn't seem like it. So then how do we use the power of collecting self-reported demographic data across all these various lenses of diversity that are important to tap into if we want to build a prosperous Canada? How do we start to collect that information in a way in which not only do we have a baseline, know if we're achieving, if whatever tool and instruments we're using are achieving that outcome of getting more capital to underfunded communities. And what gives me really hope, actually, I was talking to one of the wholesalers last week, is we were having such a phenomenal conversation of looking at using data at different stages of the diligence process, from intake to, evaluation to kind of the first to investment committee. Like, how do we use actually disaggregated demographic data to understand where are we losing, where are people being removed from the process, and then be able to analyze how and why, and then ultimately try to address that in different ways. So, I think the opportunity is there to drive. I think what we're all saying is the Social Finance Fund has this huge, bold opportunity, which is reshifting how capital flows to communities. And this will advance social and environmental impact, but it'll also advance wealth creation in communities that have been historically left out. Now, to do that, we need data. We need to do it in a proactive way. We need to do it in a collaborative way. We need to remove that black box that exists today for many that are not day-to-day as part of the work. And then ultimately kind of rethink some of these norms that exist that are preventing us from that broader access.
Right. Hilary, are you seeing any progress on trust-based funding from your vantage point?
To a degree. We actually have been really lucky to have some pretty great funders over the last, private funders over the last few years that have really allowed for us to, instead of it being so program-based, actually saying, like, these are the needs in our organization, this is what we need to be funding, and giving us that flexibility in that. But there's still a long ways to go. And again, my experience can only really come from actually having to work and operate in a more paternalistic colonial setting of having to work with the federal government a lot of the time. So I don't know if I necessarily have like the best perspective on that, but as we're still growing in this area, but we've been able to, I'm thinking about accountability, and I'm thinking about what are these pieces that allow for us to center the efforts of, say, reconciliation, for example. And that's typically what our only accountability mechanism can be a lot of the time. And so there is this opportunity to see us as a growing organization that is fulfilling this mandate, but there's still a lot more out there. So I don't know if I necessarily can answer that in the short period of time that we've been working with it.
And have you Hillary, worked in it on an investment side or a philanthropic side?
On both, actually. And again, still very new in this field for us. And so, but a lot of it really came from, as I mentioned earlier, was just a real important need to be diversifying our funding and to be really looking at impact investment and how we can sustain as much as we can for the next 7 generations down the road. And again, it's still very exploratory for us at this point.
But let's talk accountability though, Hillary, because like in your mind, I'm not seeing a whole lot of accountability mechanisms to ensure equitable access to funding, and it's very interesting because funders often ask in applications, right, like how much of this will go to communities of color or Black communities or LGBTQS folks, but there isn't, but no one's evaluating private foundations or community foundations or other types of funders on this very same thing. So what do you, like, in your mind, like, what would you expect in terms of an accountability mechanism to ensure equitable access to funding?
I think it really is about ensuring that there are these, something we so often use, and we really try and align ourselves with other funders that are doing something very similarly, but is having these sort of youth advisory mechanisms as part of their funding models. Those seem to be working really well, just to ensure, as I was saying earlier, around in terms of that integrity piece. But again, this is still early days, and we're still sorting through that and whether that accountability is a good fit for us. And I say that largely just due to the reciprocal nature of funding, right? It shouldn't necessarily be, I'm going to take this money so I can support these programs. There needs to be a shared understanding that they really understand what it is that we're trying to do here is beyond just a check mark. It's really about trying to steward this work. But I haven't, it's still very early days. It's been very difficult to navigate that, but I have seen, especially in the last 2 years, more of a shift into ensuring that there are an Indigenous advisory mechanism or like a youth advisory mechanism, just something that is in the specific field of what we're being funded for, to see that representation on the table as well. So, right.
But that is a good, it's a really interesting and quite a kind of strong stance that you folks are taking, like asking yourselves, is that accountability, a good fit for us, so like that's very powerful. I have a couple of sort of things I want to get into, but perhaps Victor, I want to explore perhaps a controversial question with you, and it's something that sort of relates to what you brought up. Like as a racialized person, I've experienced a lot of lateral violence, and just because you have diversity in a committee doesn't mean that you are authentically acting, not you specifically, but one is authentically acting, on justice, equity, inclusion, etc. I often wonder about the social costs of carve-outs, and I mentioned that because you mentioned carve-outs. And I wonder about it, and I wonder about, do carve-outs actually divide us? Is it playing into the identity politics? Does it actually spark more lateral violence? And we've seen examples of this in the past few years. So, what are your thoughts on the social costs of carve-outs?
Yeah, well, I think at the end of the day, we're wrestling with organized greed and capitalist predatory impositions. So a carve-out is a Band-Aid to a much broader solution. We have to land where we've landed, like in that market-fixing, market reform space, because things aren't equal. We're not operating within an ecosystem that centers justice, access, inclusion, diversity, and equity. And you know this better than anyone. Like, this is a prime example. Like, and this is not to bash Mars, but did Mars cough up millions of dollars to help Future of Good and SVX pull this off? Probably not. You probably have to be resilient and gritty and pull off something absolutely remarkable. Better yet, in terms of your work right now, there's organizations that have been around for 50 years doing the level of journalism that you're doing, Vinod. And I'd say you do it 10 times better. So I'm saying all to say that we're operating from a space of resilience. We're operating from a space of fixing and trying our best. And that requires a certain level of tweaking and innovation or scaffolding in some instances. Because if you lean in on the IRP, like I said before, it wasn't a Black-led investment readiness partner. And when we were able to develop a Black-led investment readiness partner, they did not have a direct relationship with the federal government. But to the original question, before you ask me this question around trust-based philanthropy and just trust in general, I want to make sure that we acknowledge our beloved brother Jonas Hassan from the Justice Fund, because when we talk about advocates or the stressors that are on folks, I saw this brilliant young man really question philanthropy around the $180 billion being hoarded. Just like $400 million is going to be hoarded through investment horizons and investment theses. You know what I mean? And I saw this young man get hate mail and go through intense scrutiny because he was being an advocate. And I think right now we have an opportunity once again to inspire people to become advocates. Like, we can't let Justin in New Brunswick speak truth to power and leave him out hanging when he talks about or affirms that this is blood money and that people are actually dying. If Justin speaks to that, he needs allies. Yeah, and I think that the challenge that we face around all this work is people, we're navigating for personal career development and advancement. So folks want to advance their own personal careers, which I understand. Folks want to advance their personal organizations or brands or logos, which I understand. And some folks on the supply side just want to line their pockets and create multiple entities and change hats. I'm the CEO of this today, CEO of this tomorrow. So I'm saying, in all that mess and confusion, how do we get resources to SPOs? How do we create better economic outcomes for Canadians in the margins, the periphery of the economy? Like, that's the ultimate question. So I understand that a carve out or a carve in may not be the apex, but the fact remains, if you talk to our colleague Shanna and NACA has been able to, Sarah McNeil and NACA has been able to do great work with that carve in. The Indigenous Growth Fund is doing great work. So we have to start somewhere, you know? And I think that's starting from a place of recognizing, you know what, we made a mistake, and we can fix the mistake by engaging those who have been that not just have the impotence to speak truth to power, but don't have conflicts of interest. Because that's another piece that we don't speak about in this sector. The fact that the people on the supply side of capital are rife with conflicts. Go ahead, Melinda.
Victor, can I just add to just one thing? Because I think the carve-out question, I'm not sure if you saw what happened with TDSB. So this is just a really good proxy. Like, so TDSB, they said we're going to allocate.
Who's TDSB, Narendra?
Oh, Toronto District School Board. For this special school, they said we're going to allocate. We understand that it's underrepresented by diverse children. So we're going to take this carve out. We're going to do 15% or 25%. It's going to include Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, you know, other communities that have been excluded. They hired a consultant. The consultant took all of the different students. They took out the community that was Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities, and then they picked 25 from that, 25% of spots from that. And then they kept them out, and from the rest, they picked the 75% of spots. And I mention that because that's actually what we do unintentionally in our sector of flowing capital. We will carve out, which we should carve out, but we also need to think about the broader and the entire portfolio and how that is flowing. Because if we're excluding the people we've carved out, then we're not doing any better in terms of advancing capital to underfunded communities.
Right. Thanks. We're very, very close to time here. I want to pull Justin in very quickly to respond to carve-outs and maybe get your take, Justin. Carve-outs for community finance, is that something that would be helpful? And then want to wrap up with want to bring you back in, and you've been listening to a lot of these perspectives and experiences. Curious what you make of all of that. So Justin, very quickly, and then we'll wrap with Jonah.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate what Narendra had to say, what Narendra had to say about carve-outs in particular, right? And particularly looking at, you know, okay, if we're carving something out, you know, are we then excluding them from the remainder of the pot, right? And so I would agree. I believe we need to have some level of a carve-out to allocate towards community-level finance, and we need to be able to recognize that we're going to have to carve out a little bit because it is simply different work. It's a little bit more intensive. There is a little bit more risk involved. Or administratively intensive sometimes, I should say, based on the level of return, right? So no, I believe that we do need to establish something in that space, and I would hope that, you know, in doing so, we'd follow Narendra's lead and in what she mentioned about ensuring that it is in no way excluding them from the mainstream of activities.
Right. Super. Thanks, Justin. Jonah, you have the last word.
Yeah, I think for me, I wanted to just add one last thing, that the conversation was a lot more about capital injection, but I think one component I wanted to add is capital circulation for the sustainability of the social finance and community finance sector. And for me, I strongly believe the only way to do this is building our community banking infrastructure. That's the only way we're able to build a sustainable ecosystem whereby this capital is not only being injected into these communities, but it's actually circulating within these communities to create better outcomes. And I think if we focus more on that, historically, this model has been proven from the credit unions, which have started to be able to solve what we're talking about, reimagining access. It has been proven over the centuries. So for us right now is how can we reimagine and build a new community banking infrastructure? Because right now within the community banking sector, the average member is over 40 years old. So how are we enabling the younger generation, the next generation, the new demographics of newcomers coming into the Canadian ecosystem to take part in that? And I think that's the long-term objective of the social finance sector.
Super, wonderful.
You can't bring up community banking without addressing banker ladies, Dr. Carolyn Shanes Hussein, Elder Abena Janelle Skerrit, Susan Henry, and all those elders and leaders who have led that movement in Canada for so long around ROSCAs.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Folks, we are past time, and I don't want to keep you folks any longer. We could easily extend this to another few hours. But listen, thank you all so very much for your time, your insights, sharing your lived experiences, your perspective. This was all very enriching for myself, and I'm sure the participants at Social Finance Forum. So thank you all very much, and we're now moving into the concurrent sessions. Thank you.